Good afternoon. Welcome at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. The program will begin with the welcome address of the Vice Rector of the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, Professor Sofia Papaioannou.
Αξιότιμε κύριε Κοσμήτορα της Νομικής Σχολής, αξιότιμε κύριε πρώην Κοσμήτορα της Νομικής Σχολής, dear excellencies, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, dear students, as a representative of the rector and the governing board of the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, I have the pleasure and the honor to welcome Mr. Volker Türk, the High Commissioner of the United Nations for Human Rights, the man charged with protecting the world's human rights, as Guardian modified him recently. He has just completed 2 years in this position. Commissioner Türk has dedicated his life to the service of the rights of humanity, and in particular to issues related to refugees. In essence, his career is entwined with United Nations and human rights, which he serves now for over 30 years. Mr. Türk takes on the trickiest of jobs in an era marked by widespread concern over authoritarian governments, the climate crisis, protracted conflicts, invasive digital tools, and the global cost of living crisis, all of which are dealing setbacks to human rights, and none of which are problems with an easy solution. 1 year ago, at the first anniversary of his assuming his present post, High Commissioner Türk stated that the present moment is the time that we have to put human rights at the center of our lives. The present situation, the current context for human rights, will be the focus of his talk this evening. Yet the contextualization of human rights is hardly a modern concern, as is the assessment of one's experience of the world in rights terms. What did it mean that people at certain moments began to address the world in rights terms? An often discussed case is Hugo Grotius's De Jure Belli ac Pacis, that separated in the 17th century between 3 meanings of the expression use. It referred to the justice that law sought to bring about, the legal act itself, and a moral quality annexed to the person, enabling that person to have or do something justly. This meant a subjective term in the language of natural law, connoting something we have in contradistinction to the larger objective of justice that it had been the purpose of law to attain under earlier religiously inclined vocabularies. It was part of the emergence of typically modern way of thinking about the relations of individuals and community that privileged the desire of self-preservation and self-perfection over the collective goals of the community. But Grotian natural law was not the only linguistic environment where rights found a home. More recent studies on the history of rights have tended to focus on later moments, the French or the American Revolution, English 19th century liberal culture, and especially institutional developments in the 20th century. All these are important contexts. Among historians of law and political thought, there is a debate, moreover, of whether the subjective rights, natural rights, and rights of man that began to emerge in the texts of jurists and political thinkers in the 17th century are the same or different from the human rights referred to in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For surely, the mere appearance of an identical expression in texts temporarily distant from each other did not necessarily signify that they meant the same thing. It is not evident that when the Universal Declaration declares that, quote, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, the implication of these are the same as when John Locke, in his second treatise, wrote in 1690 that human beings, quote, were by nature all free, equal, and independent. Locke's writing was deeply embedded in a Christian frame, and he had no difficulty to accept the inclusion of a provision on slavery in the fundamental constitutions of Carolina. On the other hand, it seems clear that the many ways in which governments that have subscribed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights intervene in the lives and properties of their citizenry would have been condemned by Locke as tyrannical. For such reasons, historians of rights have insisted on focusing away from the linguistic context to the historical context of their production, and more specifically, to the intentions of their creators. What is it that Locke and the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights wanted to achieve in view of the linguistic conventions available to them in their intellectual milieu and the socioeconomic conditions prevailing at the time when they were read? Grotius wrote in his De Jure Belli ac Pacis as a Protestant activist, a refugee from his native Holland at the time of the 30 Years' War. Locke published his two treatises on return from exile in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution that purported to rid England of the tyranny of a monarch. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written as part of the establishment of a new system of global peacemaking in the aftermath of the horrors of the Second World War. The language of rights was oriented towards a different objective in each of these situations. Understood in view of that objective, their content, ways of realization, and limits were also differently conceived. Their meaning, in other words, was different, and the enveloping context was has highlighted the way in which rights operate as aspects of political cultures. High Commissioner Türk this evening will contextualize the contemporary situation with respect to the human rights. And I'm delighted to welcome him to the National and Capodistrian University of Athens as we're looking forward to his speech. Thank you very much.
Address by the Dean of the School of Law, Professor Konstantinos Christodoulou.
Dear Vice Rector, Excellencies, dear ex-Dean, dear ambassadors, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, It's indeed great honor for me personally, as well as in my capacity as the Dean of the Law Faculty of the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, to welcome the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. The contribution of our honored guest and his achievements are about to be duly analyzed by the foremost eminently proper person, our ex-dean, the ex-dean of our law faculty and ex-president of European Court of Human Rights, Professor Dr. Linos Alexandros Sicilianos. As for this introductory speech, it will stay on two pillars mainly. The importance of human rights. Indeed, the importance of human rights increases so much that they seek to become an autonomous scientific subject matter, not only a legal one, but also a philosophical one, moral one, sociological, economic, and so on. It's worth to be said, and it's already said by our Vice Rector, that the purely legal approach of human rights is being criticized as tyrannic, since it supposedly, of course, deprives them, the human rights, from their self-legitimation. The issue, of course, refers perhaps to the Rousseau and his social contracts, but it also refers to the modern view about the subjects of international law, not only states or organizations, but also usages. Now, so far so good with the epistemological approach. Something about the legal approach. Once more, the relevance, the legal relevance of human rights, so vast that it expands all over the branches of the law. It's not only the international public law, where the case is a sort of verticalization from the states downwards to the individuals. It's the national law where the case is perhaps the directness of the effect, whether we need the intervention of the national legislator to empower individuals to exercise their rights. Especially in the field of private law, the case is the horizontality of the effect, whether we may safeguard human rights, not only vis-à-vis the state, but vis-à-vis individuals, each other. In view of all this, we might say, might argue, that indeed there are many possibilities for us both, the United Nations and the Law Faculty, to collaborate fruitfully, to exchange views and experiences. Also, schließlich, da Sie sich aus Österreich stammen, erlauben Sie mir, Herr Kommissar, Ihnen alles Gute und uns beiden, den UN und unserer juristischen Fakultät, stärkere und engere Bünde zu wünschen. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Address by the General Director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for International Organizations, Ambassador Maria Theophili.
High Commissioner, dear professors, dear colleagues, friends, students, I would like first and foremost to thank the University of Athens, Law Faculty for hosting this unique event with such a distinguished guest, Mr. Volker Türk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. In my capacity, I have the honor to represent the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Yerapetritis, who is in Brussels today. On a more personal note, I would like to express my emotion for being here today in this very hall, which brings back vivid memories from my academic years, when the notion of human rights perception started to take steps. Today's world is a different place to that of my academic years, but the challenges are no the less significant. Rising authoritarianism, increased geopolitical tensions, human rights violations, mass migration, climate change, rising inequality, the opportunity and the threat posed by the rapid rise of artificial intelligence, these are just some of these challenges. Last year, as it has already mentioned, marked the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a 75 years old historical and emblematic universal document which constitutes the cornerstone of protecting human rights. Indeed, many accomplishments have been achieved since 1948, and its core values continue to be relevant in today's world. That anniversary offers an opportunity for considering and assessing the progress our global community and each state have made in empowering their own individuals from a human rights perspective. Also, it is an opportunity to pass the torch of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to the next generations. In this spirit, I am proud to say that Greece, as an incoming member of the UN Security Council for the next 2 years, and also as a candidate country for the UN Human Rights Council for 2028-2030, maintains a strong commitment to multilateralism and to the universal, indivisible, and interrelated character of human rights, and an unwavering readiness to contribute substantially to the long-term effectiveness of the UN system. Based on dialogue with all stakeholders, diplomacy as a tool to bridge differences, as well as democracy, that is the 3 Ds of our campaign, which led us to the Security Council, my country will cooperate with all its members in order to jointly produce long-term solutions that will create conditions conducive to further enhancing the cause of human rights protection. I wish to emphasize that throughout these 2-year terms, we will conduct our work on the basis of a single principle, that of the adherence to international law. We have earned significant diplomatic capital and international recognition throughout our firm commitment to converse with all interested parties in a sincere manner, as well as by consistently pursuing a principled foreign policy based on international law. Greece will capitalize on this diplomatic legacy as an interlocutor with all UN member states and with open channels of communication, not only with our neighbors, but the whole international community. We aspire to become a bridge, an honest broker between North and South, East and West. Besides, As a country whose foreign policy is defined by the need for respect for international law, including international humanitarian law, Greece cannot but be determined to promote a charter-compliant approach to all matters related to international peace and security and consecutively to human rights protection. Furthermore, Greece strives diligently through initiatives within all international fora and domestically by adopting the necessary legislative measures to combat racism, xenophobia, hate speech, and promote intercultural dialogue. In this context, education and its prominent beneficiaries, young people, play a vital role in the transmission of values that form the foundation of our free, non-discriminatory, and democratic societies. On a final note, let us recall the words of the father of the atomic theory of the universe, the philosopher Democritus, who believed that, I quote, "Word is transformation, life is perception." That said, allow me, High Commissioner, to quote you from an opening statement at the US Human Rights Council in Geneva, where you stressed, very rightly so, that, I quote, "We are at a fork in the road. We can continue our current path, treacherous new normal, and sleepwalk into a dystopian future, or we can wake up and turn things around for the better for humanity and the planet," unquote. Let me assure you that against this dystopia of the world under transformation, you can count on Greece being steadfastly on the side of human rights protection, because this is our perception. Thank you very much.
Presentation of the distinguished career and accomplishments of the lecturer by the former president of the European Court of Human Rights, professor of the School of Law, Mr. Linos Alexander Sicilianos.
Madam Vice Rector, Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear Dean of the Law School, dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, we are very honored today, and we extend a warm welcome to His Excellency Mr. Volker Türk, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, at this critical juncture in global affairs. Mr. Türk assumed his official duties in October 2022 and has committed his extensive and distinguished career to the promotion of human rights, with particular emphasis on the international protection of some of the most vulnerable populations, including refugees and stateless persons. Mr. Türk possesses a PhD in international law from the University of Vienna and a Master of Laws degree from the University of Linz. His doctoral thesis focused on the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and its mandate. Additionally, Mr. Türk has an extensive publication record in the fields of international refugee law and international human rights law. Prior to assuming his current position, Mr. Türk served as the Under-Secretary General for Policy in the Executive Office of the United Nations Secretary General, where he was responsible for coordinating global policy initiatives. He played a pivotal role in facilitating collaboration across the UN system in relation to the Secretary General's Call to Action for Human Rights, as well as his report, Our Common Agenda, which presents a comprehensive strategy for addressing the world's interconnected challenges through the principles of trust, solidarity, and human rights. Furthermore, he previously held the key position of Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Coordination in the Executive Office of the Secretary General from 2019 to 2021. In his role as Assistant High Commissioner for Protection at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees from 2015 to 2019, Mr. Türk made significant contributions to the development of the landmark Global Compact on Refugees. Throughout his distinguished career, he has held several key positions within UNHCR, including Director of the Division of International Protection from 2009 to 2015, Director of Organizational Development and Management from 2008 to 2009, and Chief of Section for Protection Policy and Legal Advice from 2000 to 2004. Additionally, Mr. Türk has served UNHCR in various challenging assignments, including as representative in Malaysia, Assistant Chief of Mission in Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and as Regional Protection Coordinator in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Kuwait. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights stands at the pinnacle of the United Nations human rights system. The initial germ of the idea of an Attorney General for Human Rights is traced back to 1947 during the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was, however, only in 1993 that the UN General Assembly Resolution 48/141 eventually created the post of High Commissioner for Human Rights as the United Nations official with principal responsibility for United Nations human rights activities. The High Commissioner for Human Rights is appointed by the Secretary General of the United Nations and approved by the General Assembly for a fixed term of 4 years with a possibility of one renewal and with the rank of Under Secretary General of the United Nations. The High Commissioner's responsibilities are to promote universal respect for and observance of all human rights, that is, civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights, including the right to development. It is evident that in the current tumultuous circumstances the world faces, the role of the High Commissioner for Human Rights assumes particular significance. It is imperative to recognize that the High Commissioner functions as a moral authority and a representative voice for victims of human rights violations. The High Commissioner plays a critical role in guiding the office's mission and values, identifying strategic priorities, and directing its activities. Additionally, the High Commissioner is responsible for making public statements and appeals concerning human rights situations and crises, engaging in constructive dialogue with governments to enhance national human rights protection, and undertaking extensive travel to ensure that human rights messages resonate across all regions of the world. Furthermore, the High Commissioner endeavors to integrate human rights standards across all United Nations programs, ensuring that peace and security, development, and human rights, the three essential pillars of the United Nations system, remain interlinked and mutually reinforcing. It is vital that human rights serve as the foundational bedrock upon which all United Nations activities are built. Furthermore, the support of the High Commissioner for the work of the UN human rights treaty bodies is crucial for their effectiveness. I personally witnessed this importance when I served as a member of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. As the High Commissioner speaks openly and publicly about the global protection level of human rights and combats impunity, the work of the High Commissioner and the Office has expectedly attracted criticism and/or backlash. Indeed, the institution was brutally attacked back in 2003 when the then High Commissioner Sergio Vieira de Mello, together with 21 of his colleagues, were victims of a bomb attack on the UN's headquarters in Baghdad, Iraq, on the afternoon of 19 August 2003. The Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination was in session when the tragic event was announced. I will never forget the absolute silence in the room and the profound sadness and helplessness of us all. Contemporary challenges to the enjoyment of human rights are more pressing than at any previous time in recent history. Ongoing and/or protracted conflicts in the Middle East, in Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, Ethiopia, and the Sahel all inflict tremendous human suffering to civilian populations. But even apart from international peace and security, further and important human rights challenges continuously flourish. With respect to the protection of the human right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, governments are grappling with the consequences of the hottest year on record, facing an onslaught of wildfires, droughts, and storms that have wreaked havoc on millions of individuals in countries such as Bangladesh, Libya, and Canada. The rights of women have encountered substantial challenges in numerous regions, epitomized by the Taliban's gender-based persecution in Afghanistan. Human rights legal instruments serve as reliable mechanisms to provide effective protection to victims. Today, the role of the High Commissioner is that of a human rights advocate, a human face for human rights, which the world needs perhaps more than ever. It is not coincidental that many recent or ongoing armed conflicts in Europe have led to interstate cases before the European Court of Human Rights. Concurrently, in recognition of the universality and erga omnes partes character of human rights obligations, states increasingly utilize major human rights treaties as a jurisdictional basis to pursue accountability for gross human rights violations before the International Court of Justice. The Genocide Convention, the Convention Against Torture, and the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination are today invoked in relation to pending cases concerning the situation in Ukraine, in the Gaza Strip, in Myanmar, in Syria, or in Nagorno-Karabakh. This is an unprecedented phenomenon in the history of the ICJ, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. It demonstrates the centrality of human rights in the current context. It is thus with great interest that we shall listen to the keynote speech of the High Commissioner on this very subject. I thank you for your kind attention, and I kindly invite His Excellency Mr. Volker Türk to the podium.
Lecture by Mr. Volker Türk, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, entitled The Centrality of Human Rights in the Current Context.
Dear Vice Rector, dear Dean, distinguished professors, excellencies, distinguished students, dear friends, Kalispera. It's a really great pleasure and a great honor to be here with you today at Athens University, which is, as I understand it, the oldest university in modern Greece and indeed in the Eastern Mediterranean. Nobel Prize laureates, prime ministers, presidents, groundbreaking scientists, and visionary writers and poets have walked these halls. And today, they are filled with Greece's lawyers, leaders, and human rights activists of today and tomorrow. I have a deep love for Greece and its people. I visit it almost every year. It is a place where I reconnect with nature, with the air, with the sea, and I have an abiding love of Greek culture. The work of Nobel laureate Yorgos Seferis is a particular favorite. His themes of displacement, exile, longing, and loss resonate strongly today as we see the increased displacement across the globe. But it is no coincidence that Xeferis poetry really reflects Greek culture and Greek's place in the world as a bridge between Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. As a great seagoing nation, Greek sailors and explorers traveled and formed communities around the Mediterranean Sea and across the world. Meanwhile, Turks, Jews, Central Asians, people from the Caucasus, the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond have formed vibrant communities in Greece. Yorgos Seferis was himself born in Smyrna, in present-day Turkey. And another great poet who I admire, Konstantinos Kavafis, was born in Alexandria in Egypt. The Turkish leader Atatürk was born in the melting pot of Thessaloniki. Before the Nazi occupation of Greece, Thessaloniki was one of the centers of European Jewish culture. The Holocaust Museum that is under construction there speaks to Greece's determination to honor those killed and to recognize the crimes of the past. This is extremely important at a time when Holocaust denial and other forms of anti-Semitism are increasing across Europe. And we should not forget the tens of thousands of Greek refugees who fled the Nazi occupation to Egypt, Syria, and beyond. I remember, and I was deeply moved by a picture that I saw, an old photograph of Greeks who sought shelter in Damascus. There is nothing new under the sun, as the saying goes. The links and cross-fertilization between peoples are part of what makes Greece culture so beautiful, diverse, and so rich. And today, when people are building walls rather than bridges, we cannot allow this to be forgotten. Dear students, many years ago, I was one of you, a law student. I believed then, as I still believe today, that law is fundamental to civilized societies. Laws are the means by which we translate our common values into reality, the formal expression of some of humanity's deepest beliefs and hopes. As a student, I was profoundly influenced by the ancient Greek philosophers and their focus on justice and ethics, on moral integrity, on critical self-inquiry. Their idea that certain protections for people have always existed without depending on any kind of formal law is a clear forerunner to the modern understanding of human rights inherent to all people. In today's world, the rule of law is there to protect the vulnerable, to prevent discrimination, harassment, and other abuses, to resolve disputes, and to defend against atrocity crimes, up to and including genocide. It fosters trust in each other and in public institutions, and it supports strong, cohesive, resilient communities and societies. My own studies led to the realization that law is inseparable from the realization of the rights that are inherent in each and every human being. This simple but powerful idea guided my whole life and career ever since. Dear students, the education that you receive here in this institution is not only about facts, but about values. It is not just about how the world works, but how we treat one another. We need that focus more than ever. A human rights crisis is unfolding around the world today, and we see the challenges that are coming together in many different combinations. Not far from here, across the Mediterranean Sea, a horrific war has been raging for more than a year as Israel remains locked in a conflict with Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups in Gaza. It is clear that there can be no justification for the atrocities that were committed by Hamas and others against Israelis on the 7th of October last year. It is also clear that there is never justification for collective punishment of civilian people. My UN colleagues working in northern Gaza describe conditions that are apocalyptic. More than 43,000 people have been killed since the conflict exploded last October, and nearly 2 million Palestinians have been forced from their homes, many multiple times. Palestinian armed groups continue to hold hostages, to operate among civilians, and to fire rockets into Israel in flagrant violation of international law. Meanwhile, in Sudan, the world's worst humanitarian crisis is currently unfolding, a situation that is equally deserving of the world's international attention, but unfortunately, you hardly ever see anything written about Sudan. The rival leaders who I met when I was first in my office very early on in November 22 have launched an all-out bloody conflict over power and resources, fueled by long-standing impunity, competing economic interests, and the instrumentalization of ethnic tensions. In Ukraine, tomorrow it will be 1,000 days since Russia's full-scale invasion, and we see a terrible devastation as we end recurring very serious human rights violations. Attacks on, you just heard, massive attacks on civilian infrastructure, energy systems that raise serious concerns for people's lives and livelihoods, especially if you think of people who are disabled or older people when they face a very heavy winter and in the absence of energy. I have warned many times that the grave violations of international humanitarian and human rights law being committed in these conflicts may amount to war crimes and other atrocity crimes. From Gaza to Sudan and Ukraine, from Myanmar to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, parties to armed conflict are riding roughshod over the laws of war, which, by the way, are 160 years old. Civilians are targeted, hospitals destroyed, aid workers attacked, humanitarian access refused. Violations of human rights are leading to greater violence and deeper brutalization. It's something that sometimes really gets forgotten. They are eroding international legal norms that were created to prevent humankind from destroying itself. And they are creating a legacy of trauma and grievances that will last generations. Today's conflict are also forcing record numbers of people to flee across borders, sometimes to countries where, again, they risk demonization simply on the basis of their nationality or their religion. Dear friends, beyond the intensification of conflict, several other global trends have a devastating impact on human rights around the world. A financial crisis and a debt disaster, combined with the accelerating impact of climate change, are impoverishing many countries, in particular in the global south. I'm sure many of you grew up in the shadow of Greece's own economic crisis. You know that red figures on a state's balance sheet can translate into a sudden shift in the lives of ordinary people towards poverty, job loss, and healthcare, and indeed hopelessness. That is now happening across the developing world. Global plans to reduce hunger by 2030 are slipping out of reach as the gains that were made since 2005 have essentially been wiped out. Many of the same countries that are struggling with this financial crisis are also being battered by climate chaos. Across a broad swathe of Africa, droughts are reducing harvests and making farming unsustainable. This human rights crisis may not always make the headlines, but it is having a deadly impact. People are dying, communities are suffering, and there is little hope on the horizon. Small wonder that people are prepared to risk their lives on a dangerous journeys across deserts and seas in search of a better future, a profoundly human drive which has motivated people since time immemorial. Dear students, dear friends, a further global threat to human rights comes from the rise of authoritarianism and populism, often based on divisive and polarized narratives. Racism, anti-Semitism, anti-Islamic rhetoric, xenophobia and hate speech plague our societies. They are rooted in entrenched power structures, and they have an extraordinary reach on social platforms. But we know where this leads to. Hate speech is a clear precursor to hateful actions, including harassment, intimidation, and violence. Irresponsible leaders who think they can harness hate for their own ends are playing with fire. Patriarchal stereotypes that discriminate against women, girls, and non-binary people are part of that authoritarian toolkit. Sexual violence remains rampant, and women's sexual and reproductive health rights are being rolled back. Afghanistan is the most extreme example of state-sponsored misogyny and, indeed, gender apartheid. Meanwhile, more and more governments are imposing restrictions on the media, on non-governmental organizations and other civil society, including human rights defenders. And new technologies, including artificial intelligence, offer new tools for the spread and reinforcement of disinformation, to interfere with elections, and to subject people to surveillance on a massive scale. I admit I have painted a disturbing and concerning picture. Again, to quote Yorgos Seferis, we are lost because we have been unjust. We are failing to respect and deliver on human rights, and the consequences are clear. But I want to assure you that it is not too late. All these challenges were created by humankind, and there are effective, proven solutions that are also centered on humankind. So the antidote is the same. And in fact, human rights can guide us through the fog of conflict, of crisis, and uncertainty. They provide a compass and a roadmap to navigate war and violence, to protect the vulnerable, and to provide lives of dignity and opportunity for all people. They represent a normative, a legally binding framework that encompasses everyone, everywhere. Those rights have already achieved an enormous impact since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was born 76 years ago. Two world wars have just been fought in 20 years at the cost of tens of millions of lives. The appalling systematic genocide of the Holocaust had shocked the world. The atomic age brought weapons that threatened humanity as a whole. And it was then that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was born and represented a collective determination to consign such horrors to the past. It aspired to a world in which disputes are resolved peacefully without resorting to war. And over the past 76 years, it has helped to guide great progress. The post-war period saw many colonized countries take back their independence. It saw human rights flourish in protest movements against discrimination on grounds of sex, race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, and other factors. Massive advances were made in social protection, education and health, and labor standards. The connection between all this and your studies is clear. Justice is central to human rights as the only way to end impunity through accountability and remedy. Justice and accountability protect human rights by deterring and preventing violations and by confronting and addressing them when they do happen. Over the past 76 years, the body of international human rights law and the laws of war have been developed to prevent and reduce the suffering of civilians caught up in crisis and conflict. Institutions of international justice have been established, from the International Court of Justice that the former president of the European Court has just mentioned, to the International Criminal Court, and the diverse UN and UN-assisted mechanisms. The Human Rights Council itself, to which I hope Greece will become a member in 2028, the fact-finding missions, the commissions of inquiry, complement these mechanisms, as of course do also national courts. All countries, as members of the United Nations, have a legal obligation to uphold binding judgments and decisions of the International Court of the International Tribunals, and in particular of the International Court of Justice. Criminal accountability for the most serious violations is a cornerstone of our human rights architecture. Separately, the International Criminal Court is a linchpin of accountability for the worst atrocity crimes and crimes against humanity. We need all countries to back the court consistently, which is currently, unfortunately, not the case. I'm convinced that the human rights ideal has been one of the most constructive movements in human history, and frankly, one of the most successful. How could the simple text of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights guide such profound transformation? Because it is based on a powerful truth. Human rights work. They are not an abstraction or a dream, but they are a concrete solution. They work for peace, for justice, for opportunity. They work for people, and they work for our planet. And to quote from the Declaration, recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace. Respect for human rights, respect for all human rights, supports societies that are founded on justice, on fairness, and on economies that are more inclusive, and on decision-making that is more participatory and more effective as a result. Universality is key to the effective implementation of human rights, which belong to everyone, everywhere. I would like to take this opportunity to debunk two myths that challenge this universality. First, the myth that human rights are a luxury that poor countries cannot afford, and that we can only worry about them when we have peaceful societies and prosperous economies. Actually, human rights were designed for a world on its knees, an impoverished world, a world caught up in conflict and chaos. This is why my office's reporting and monitoring in war zones is so absolutely critical. Indeed, one understanding of war is that it is the ultimate violation of human rights. In Gaza and Israel, in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Myanmar, human rights violations are not separate from war, they are the war. So it stands to reason that ending those violations is the path to sustainable peace. We don't hear enough about peace, unfortunately. We also know that human rights are critical to effective economic systems, from trade treaties to investment agreements to business regulation to development frameworks. Last year, I launched the concept of a human rights economy to challenge the current economic thinking, which is based on models that, frankly, are no longer fit for purpose. And they do not take into account the human rights obligations that states themselves have accepted, especially economic and social rights. A second myth is that human rights are essentially a Western concept used to oppress and constrain other countries. That's simply not the case. The drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights transcended geopolitical clashes and economic differences. They set aside disputes to reach agreement on a text that represents the collective wisdom of many cultures and histories. the African values of independence, of cooperation and collective responsibility. We always hear about the French and the American revolutions, but there was the Haitian Revolution 216 years ago, which was a revolution against slavery, racism, and colonialism. There is Islam's emphasis on human dignity and compassionate sharing, the freedoms of the Enlightenment, the feminism of India's feminist Hansa Mehta, who was part of the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the fundamental oneness of Asian spiritual traditions, and the insistence on universality and indivisibility of many Latin American voices, and much more. Everywhere I go, I'm reminded of that universality of human rights. When I visited Sudan 2 years ago, the hopeful voices were the voices of women and young people who had overthrown a 30-year-old military dictatorship. In fact, they called for more human rights rather than less, and they are suffering enormously as we speak. And just last month, I was in Bangladesh, where a pro-democracy movement that was started by students led to a change of government earlier this year. I'm sure you have followed these developments. Dear students, dear friends, we finally come to the question of how these lessons apply to your lives today. I'm sure you have all your own thoughts, and I look forward to hearing them. But let me propose a couple of ideas. At your age, as a law student growing up under the shadow of Austria's history and complicity during World War II, my university friendships with students from all backgrounds and countries made a deep impression on me. For the first time, I understood the importance of a global system that is anchored in solidarity, fairness, and justice. In fact, the human rights and justice system that I've just described. As a result, I chose to work for the United Nations, for refugees, for humanitarian assistance, and for human rights. I encourage you to consider making your own contribution to equality and justice, building on your country's long history of pro-democracy and human rights movements, including, as I saw yesterday, the Polytechnic uprising that was commemorated yesterday. Social and economic rights must be upheld, even under austerity measures. I think that's one important lesson to be learned from Greece's experience. Deep cuts to public spending must not have a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable people in the society, the poor, women and girls, people with disabilities and minorities. Social security systems must be aimed at reducing poverty and inequality if they are to reinforce social cohesion. Healthcare must always be accessible to everyone, including the most isolated and marginalized, in rural areas and remote islands, for example. Media freedom must be protected. Lawsuits must never be used to suppress critical reporting or to pressurize journalists. Surveillance of journalists is a serious infringement on their rights, and we need free and independent media. Discrimination against women and girls remains the most prevalent human rights violation in the world. Violence, including femicide, is its most extreme and deadly form. Police and lawyers must be sensitized to how these crimes affect survivors and victims and trained to prevent and prosecute them. Dear students, some of you will have personal experience or knowledge of rights neglected, denied, or violated. Here in Greece, these experiences may be connected with the hardships that followed the austerity measures, or they are connected with the situation of people on the move, to name just two examples. On the latter, of course, the history of the Mediterranean is central to understanding the interconnected roots of many modern societies. It is all the more tragic that this beautiful sea is being used today to divide rather than unite us. All countries share responsibility for people fleeing war, extreme poverty, and climate chaos, for ensuring that they are safe and that their human rights are respected, and for opening regular routes for migration so that no one risks their life on such dangerous journeys. As lawyers, as human rights defenders, and the gatherers of stories, we cannot forget the lessons of the past or our shared histories. They are part of what connects us and makes us human. The countries of Europe are being called on, before the eyes of the world, to stand up for human rights in a very concrete way. I urge you, as future lawyers, as human beings, to consider what you can do to support and protect human rights today and in the future. Strive to ensure that everyone has access to adequate housing, to education, to healthcare as a matter of right. Strive to ensure that when things go wrong, that the lessons are learned and that accountability is served. Have difficult conversations, even in the face of fierce disagreement. Push for the protection of refugees and for the protection of migrants, and for the community organizations, the civil society organizations that work for their rights. Question harmful narratives that vilify vulnerable people, and look for ways to build on Greece's long history of welcome and hospitality, philoxenia, cultural diversity, and mutual respect. Never underestimate your own personal contribution, which is more important and urgent than you may know. History and facts do not provide a full answer to today's challenges, and law alone is not the answer. Human rights are about facts, about the law, but also, importantly, about compassion. Of course, these three, compassion may be the most valuable. I'm deeply impressed by today's youth-led social movements that are showing new models of leadership with compassion. And I have seen them myself in the two country examples that I've mentioned, but also when it comes to fighting for climate justice, for example. You already have everything you need to get involved in shaping your societies and our global community. And to quote again Yorgos Seferis, in our gradually shrinking world, everyone is in need of all the others. I hope you follow your hearts and trust in your vision of what our world can be. Despite the challenges that we face, I believe that together we can get to a much better place. Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
End of the event. Thank you very much for your presence.